When I lived in Australia for a year with a close friend of mine, one of the biggest rules that we learned was to not go swimming in unmarked waters or bodies of water that were not designated as swimming areas. This was something that we took to heart as we had a major fear of running into crocs or any of the many venomous snakes or deadly animals that inhabited that continent. That being said, this never stopped us from hopping into a dinghy and going on a fishing trip on the river. More often than not, we chose to go on a local river that we had fished a few times during our period when we lived there. However, this one day, we decided to go for a bit of a drive to a spot where we were told that there was some good-sized bass to be fished. When we got to the spot, my buddy Mac and I got everything set up with the dinghy and made sure that we had all of our tackle and rods before ultimately pushing off into the river. The current wasn't too strong, but strong enough to where it allowed us not to have to do much. We just kinda drifted along as we casually cast out into the river. We didn't get many bites for a while, but believe me when I tell you that there is nothing more relaxing than floating down a river underneath the sun in Australia. After a little while though, we did end up getting our first bite, and in no time, Mac was reeling in our first catch of the day. It was a relatively small barramundi, so we ended up throwing it back in the water to grow some more. As we floated on, one of the hardest things to ignore was all of the eyes that were on us every now and again. In the boat we were safe, but had we gone into the water, we would have been surrounded by countless crocs, most of which would have seen us long before we saw them. We didn't let this ruin our trip and just continued drifting slowly downstream with our lines in the water. I remember there was one particularly large crocodile that almost looked like it was getting ready to follow us or even go after our lines. But after it disappeared underneath the surface of the water, we just told ourselves that it had moved along and gone about its own business. After floating for about an hour and a half, the two of us figured it would be a good time to have some lunch. So we reeled in our lines and pulled out the cooler, which had a couple of sandwiches in it and some water for us to drink. We took a couple minutes to enjoy our meal and really take in the sights around us before we were startled by a sound that we weren't expecting. From behind us in the water, we began to hear this splashing sound, and when we looked, we could see a large croc thrashing around the water with something hanging out of its mouth. It looked like a fish to me, but we couldn't get a good enough look to be certain. Mac and I both stood up and watched as this massive beast continued to thrash around in the water for a minute. We both found ourselves wondering if it was that large one that we had seen earlier that we had thought it disappeared. Had it still been following our boat? We didn't have much time to think about it either, as foolishly neither of us was paying attention to the front of the boat, and before we could look away from the attack that was going on behind us, the front of our boat knocked a rock and our dinghy bounced up and down. I lost my balance and got tossed right into the water. As soon as I went under, I knew that I was in a bad situation, especially when I resurfaced and noticed that thrashing behind me had stopped. I knew right then that the croc had shifted its attention to me. I looked over to Mac, who had managed to stay in the dinghy. He was doing his best to turn around quickly and bring it back to me, but I didn't have time to wait. I began swimming right for the shore where I could see the roots of the large trees near the bank. I hoped that I could make it to the trees and pull myself out before the beast got to me. Sadly, I was mistaken. I had only managed to swim about 4 yards before I felt an immense amount of pressure come bearing down on my left calf. I was pulled underneath the water where I began to be spun and tossed around by a massive crocodile. I could hardly see anything through the dirt and bubbles in the water, and I'm still unsure why, but after a second I felt the jaws of the beast release from my leg. I didn't waste any time making my way back up to the surface of the water. Luckily, Mac had managed to get back to me by the time I reached the surface. I felt his arm grab me and pull me out of the water and into the dinghy. As soon as I was in the boat, he proceeded to speed us out of the area and tossed me a phone to call for help as we made our way back to a dock where I could receive assistance. At the end of the day, I was lucky and only needed a handful of stitches on both sides of my leg. I had always wanted to go spearfishing, and when I went on my vacation to the Bahamas for my sister's wedding, I made sure to check that off my bucket list. The Bahamas were like nothing I'd ever seen before, not having left my home state of New York in my entire life. The water was a crystal blue, just like in all the movies and commercials that you see on TV, and the amount of beautiful looking fish that you could see right from the surface was amazing. On my first day there, my family and I spent most of our time in the water at the beach, while my sister and her fiance made sure the venue and wedding were all set up. The next day, we had the rehearsal, which was supposed to be followed by the wedding on the next night of the third day. However, there was a slight change of plans after my sister's fiance decided that he wanted to go out spearfishing with me on the trip that I booked. Now, from everything that the guide that we spoke to said, this wasn't going to be anything super dangerous, and we weren't going to be heading into any dangerous waters or currents. So my sister didn't mind that James was coming with me, and she actually encouraged it. So that morning, James and I met up for some breakfast and then made our way to the boat that was going to take us and teach us how to spearfish. They let us know right away that we wouldn't catch anything on our first trip, and they weren't going to take us anywhere that was too deep for our own safety. As soon as we were on the water, James and I began having a blast with our guides. They were telling jokes the whole time and we were having a ball. And in no time, we were at the reef where we were going to be getting into the water. Our guide went over the gear that we would be using and told us the proper and safest way to carry, swim with, and fire our spear. The main thing was not to point or fire it in any direction that had any other divers. I felt like we wasted no time getting into the water, which was the perfect temperature. And as soon as we got in, we were on our way down. I can't quite describe how peaceful it is underneath the surface of the water and how quiet it is. But even though I had a small group of swimmers around me who were all on the same mission as me, I somehow felt as if I were alone in the water, just me and the fish. That's how easy it is to get lost and lose focus on everyone around you when you're underneath the water. As I was swimming along, I saw a few fish that looked like they would make easy targets. So I lined up my spear, and after a second, I took a shot. And I missed, by a lot. I learned the hard way how difficult it was to spearfish properly that day, and it seemed as though James was having the same issue. That was until I heard him exclaim excitedly. I turned and could see the bubbles pouring out of his mouth as he screamed, and as I followed the line that he hooked with his spear gun, I found the spear, and sure enough, it was a clean hit. James began dragging the fish in toward him, and then signaled for us to go upward, so I began to ascend. I was a bit ahead of James, and as soon as I broke the surface of the water, I could hear one of our guides on the boat yelling, "Shark! Shark!" I began to panic. I looked down into the water, and at first, I saw nothing. Then I looked over to James, who was still making his way up to me, and sure enough, about 3 yards behind him was one of the largest animals I had ever seen. And James had no idea. I began waving my hands to warn him, and he knew that something was wrong right away. He slowed down a bit and began to turn, not knowing that he was about to face a beast that he was in no way prepared for. It's unclear if the shark had meant to go for James, or was just trying to get an easy snack from the fish that he had caught. But as James turned to face it, all he saw were rows of teeth as the shark began to rip through his right arm, which was carrying the fish. Blood began to fill the water, and out of the red cloud, I saw the shark swimming away. And shortly after, James shot his way to the surface, where one of the guides was waiting to pull him to the boat. We made it back to the shore, and James was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that too much damage had been done to his forearm, and that they would have to amputate up to just beneath the elbow on his right arm. It was determined that it was more likely a tiger shark that attacked him that day. My sister's wedding was postponed, but at the end of the day, we were all just thankful that James made it out of the water alive. It was toward the end of the summer in 2002 when I was on a hike with my younger son that I would never forget. He was about 7 years old at the time, and his mother was visiting her sister in Florida, so it had just been the two of us enjoying the house for the weekend, and my son was having a blast. We watched a few movies and played Nerf darts all through the house. I bought him some pizza and McDonald's for food. It was one of the best times of my life. And one day, I suggested that we go on a hike, and he loved that idea. He loved going on adventures with me. So sure enough, we made our way to the local trail, and after parking the car, we began walking down the stone trail. This particular trail was perfect because it was about 2 miles long, and it ended at a small waterfall, which was where we would turn around and then head back to the car. We had been walking for about 45 minutes, and my son was having a blast looking at all the trees and the small squirrels that were running around. I was also enjoying the fresh air, but for some reason, I was beginning to get a strange feeling in my gut that was telling me that maybe we should turn around. I brushed it off as nothing though, and my son and I continued walking. It wasn't until we rounded the corner up ahead of us that I realized that I should have listened to my gut. As we rounded the bend, I was stopped dead in my tracks, and I had to stop my son from getting too excited. Sitting directly on the trail in front of us was an adolescent mountain lion cub. And while that might sound adorable, and it was understandably why my son was excited, it was also a very terrifying moment, as I knew the mother wasn't too far away. And to make things even scarier, I had no idea where she would be coming from. But I knew that she would spot me first. I grabbed my son and pulled him in close to me, and right before I could tell him to begin walking back down the trail slowly, we heard the low growl that I had feared so much coming from the bushes alongside of the trail. My heart raced, and I made sure to stand as tall but still as possible as a full-grown mountain lion jumped out from the bushes and stood between us and the cub. She was hissing and growling, and periodically would stomp her front 2 paws forward on the ground as if she was telling me to back off. I made sure that my son was all the way behind me, and I very calmly told him to slowly start walking back down the trail, but not to turn around. I don't know how true it is, but I had heard that you don't want to turn your back on a big cat, so I kept my eyes on it as we slowly began to walk away. To my horror, though, the cat continued to follow us down the trail, growling and snarling the entire way. Every so often, it would stomp its feet as it would rush forward, and I knew at any moment me and my son could die. Thankfully, I think it was only trying to get us away from its cub, and after about a mile of slowly walking down the trail, the mountain lion decided that it had enough, and it turned to run back down the trail towards its cub. My son and I continued to walk slowly to our car, in the same fashion that we had been walking when we were fleeing the massive predator, as we didn't want it to come back and get the jump on us. That was the last hike that we went on for about a year, and we made sure to be prepared for an encounter like that should it ever happen again. Thankfully, it never has.